Story 1. The Whispering Footsteps. My name is Jenny Thomas, and I've been a nurse for over a decade. I've worked in bustling city hospitals and quiet rural clinics, but nothing prepared me for the eerie events I experienced during my time at St. Augustine Community Hospital. This story takes place 2 years ago when I was working the night shift in the intensive care unit, ICU. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but it has haunted me ever since. St. Augustine Community Hospital was a small facility tucked away in a sleepy Midwestern town. The ICU was a 9-bed unit located on the second floor, completely isolated from the rest of the hospital by 2 heavy double doors. Above us, the third floor was abandoned and used for storage, while below us was radiology, which closed promptly at 5 p.m. every day. The ICU had an open layout, allowing us to see every room from the nurses' station. It was a quiet place most nights, with only the hum of monitors and the occasional shuffle of footsteps breaking the silence. But that night was different. It started around midnight. I was sitting at the nurses' station with my colleagues, charting patient notes and sipping lukewarm coffee to stay awake. Suddenly, we all heard it. Footsteps echoing down the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I glanced at my coworker Sarah, who raised an eyebrow at me. "Is someone up?" she asked. I shook my head. "Everyone's accounted for," I replied, gesturing toward the monitors displaying each patient's vitals. None of them had moved from their beds. Curious, I stood up and peered down the hallway. It was empty. The fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow on the linoleum floor, but there was no sign of anyone. "Maybe someone from radiology came up," Sarah suggested. "Radiology closes at 5, I reminded her. "And no one else is supposed to be on this floor." We shrugged it off as our imaginations playing tricks on us and went back to our work. But deep down, I felt uneasy. An hour later, things escalated. Sarah and I were making rounds when we heard a loud bang coming from one of the empty rooms at the end of the hall. We froze in our tracks and exchanged nervous glances. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. I nodded and cautiously approached room 7, where the noise had come from. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I felt a chill run down my spine. Inside, the cupboard doors were swinging open and shut on their own, as if an invisible force was slamming them repeatedly. My heart raced as I stepped into the room and reached out to stop them. The moment my hand touched one of the doors, they stopped abruptly. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale. "What's going on?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But this isn't normal." We returned to the nurses' station, trying to rationalize what we had just seen. Maybe there was a draft? Maybe one of us had left a window open? But none of those explanations made sense. All the windows were sealed shut. As we sat there in silence, we heard it again. Footsteps echoing down the hallway. This time, they were accompanied by something even more chilling. A faint whispering sound. It was barely audible at first, like someone muttering under their breath. But as it grew louder, we realized it wasn't just one voice. It was several voices overlapping each other in an unintelligible chorus. Sarah clutched my arm tightly. "Jenny," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" "I don't know," I said again, feeling utterly helpless. The next morning, after our shift ended, I decided to ask one of the senior nurses about what we had experienced. Her name was Margaret, a no-nonsense woman who had worked at St. Augustine for over 30 years. When I told her about the footsteps and cupboard doors, she didn't seem surprised. "That happens sometimes," she said matter-of-factly. "What do you mean?" I asked. Margaret leaned in closer and lowered her voice. "It usually happens after someone passes away suddenly," she explained. "It's like their spirit doesn't realize they're gone yet." I felt a chill run down my spine as her words sank in. 2 patients had coded in our unit earlier that week, both of them sudden and unexpected deaths. Margaret continued, "This place has seen its fair share of tragedy over the years. Some say it leaves an imprint, like an echo that never fades." That night, I returned to work feeling uneasy but determined to face whatever came my way. As soon as my shift began, strange things started happening again. Lights flickering in empty rooms, unexplained cold spots near patients' bedsides, and that same haunting whisper echoing through the halls. Around 3 a.m., while making rounds alone, I entered room 5 to check on a patient recovering from surgery. As I adjusted his 4 drip, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. I turned around slowly, and there it was. A shadowy figure stood in the corner of the room. It was tall and featureless, its form shifting like smoke in a breeze. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other in silence. Then it vanished. I stumbled out of the room and ran back to the nurse's station, gasping for breath. Sarah took one look at me and knew something had happened. "I saw it," I whispered hoarsely. "I saw something." I never worked another night shift at St. Augustine after that incident. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or why those strange events occurred, but they changed me forever. Some people say hospitals are just buildings, brick and mortar filled with machines and medicine, but I know better now. Hospitals are places where life begins and ends every day, a crossroads where energy lingers long after people are gone. And sometimes, that energy doesn't leave quietly. Story 2. The Doppelgänger in the Hallway. My name is Rachel Miller, and I've been a nurse for over 15 years. I've worked in various hospitals across the country, but nothing compares to the chilling experience I had during my time at Brookhaven State Hospital. This story is not just about what I saw, but about how it changed everything I thought I knew about reality. To this day, I can't step into a hospital without feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. Brookhaven was an old hospital, built in the 1920s and full of creaky floors, dimly lit hallways, and an unsettling quietness that seemed to hang in the air like a fog. The building had been partially renovated over the years, but certain wings, like the one we were temporarily relocated to, still bore the marks of its age. It was the kind of place where shadows seemed to linger just a little too long, and where every sound echoed unnaturally. We were stationed in this wing while our regular unit underwent remodeling. It was supposed to be a temporary move, but from the moment we arrived, something felt a bit weird. The air was heavy, and even during the day, the hallways seemed darker than they should have been. It was a quiet night shift, one of those rare evenings when most patients were stable, and there wasn't much to do besides routine checks. Around 2 a.m., I decided to make my rounds. As I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I saw someone ahead of me, a man named Thomas, one of our residents. Thomas was hard to miss. He had a distinct gait, almost a shuffle, and always wore the same yellow t-shirt with a faded smiley face on it. He was known for his mischievous nature and his tendency to wander off if not closely monitored. "Thomas," I called out. "You know you're not supposed to be out here alone." He didn't respond, but kept walking toward the end of the hall. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he were in no rush to get anywhere. I quickened my pace to catch up with him. "Thomas," I said again, more firmly this time, "let's get you back to your room." But as I reached the spot where I had seen him just moments before, he was gone. The hallway ended at a locked door that led to an unused section of the hospital. There was no way he could have gone through it without setting off an alarm. Confused, I turned back toward the nurse's station. When I arrived, I found one of my colleagues, Lisa, standing there with Thomas by her side. "Found him trying to sneak into the pantry," she said with a smirk. I stared at them in disbelief. "That's impossible," I stammered. "I just saw him at the end of the hall." Lisa frowned. "You must be tired," she said dismissively. "He's been here with me for the past 10 minutes. But I knew what I had seen. The next night, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just me who saw him. Another nurse, Jake, was making rounds when he spotted Thomas walking into one of the empty rooms at the far end of the wing. Jake called out to him but got no response. When he entered the room moments later, it was empty. Jake returned to the nurse's station looking pale. "Rachel," he said quietly, "didn't you say you saw Thomas last night?" I nodded. "I think there's something wrong with this place," he whispered. We decided to check on Thomas together. When we reached his room, we found him sound asleep in his bed, completely unaware of what had just happened. The following morning, after our shift ended, Jake and I decided to dig into the hospital's history. We spoke with one of the older staff members who had worked there for decades, a woman named Margaret who seemed to know every story about Brookhaven's past. When we told her about our experiences with Thomas, her expression darkened. "You're not crazy," she said after a long pause. "You probably saw his brother." "His brother?" Jake asked incredulously. Margaret nodded solemnly. Thomas had an identical twin brother named Michael who died in this very building 10 years ago. She went on to explain that Michael had been a patient at Brookhaven before his death. A tragic accident involving an untreated medical condition that spiraled out of control due to neglect from underfunded staff at the time. Ever since then, there had been reports of people seeing Michael wandering the halls late at night. He always wore that same yellow t-shirt, Margaret added quietly. Armed with this unsettling knowledge, Jake and I returned for another night shift. We tried to focus on our work and ignore the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Around 3 a.m., while checking on patients together, we heard footsteps echoing down the hallway behind us. We turned around simultaneously. And there he was. Michael stood at the far end of the hall, his yellow t-shirt glowing faintly under the dim lights. His face was obscured by shadow, but his posture and gait were unmistakable. It was as if we were looking at a mirror image of Thomas. "Michael!" Jake called out hesitantly. The figure didn't respond but began walking toward us slowly and deliberately. My heart pounded in my chest as every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. When he was just a few feet away from us, he stopped abruptly and looked directly at me. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we locked eyes, and then he vanished into thin air. After that night, neither Jake nor I ever saw Michael again, but his presence lingered in our minds long after we left Brookhaven State Hospital for good. Some people might dismiss our story as hallucinations or tricks played by tired minds during long night shifts, but we know what we saw, and we'll never forget it. Hospitals are places where life begins and ends every day, a crossroads where energy lingers long after people are gone. And sometimes, that energy takes on a form we can see but never truly understand. Story 3. Rocking Mary. My name is Claire Bennett, and I've been a nurse for over 20 years. I've seen my share of strange things in hospitals, things that defy logic and reason, but nothing compares to what I experienced at St. Joseph's Medical Center. This story takes place about 10 years ago when I was working the night shift in the Respiratory Intensive Care Unit, RICU. It's a story I've tried to forget, but no matter how hard I try, the memory lingers. St. Joseph's was an old Catholic hospital, built in the 1940s and steeped in history. The RICU was located on the second floor, directly above the hospital chapel and adjacent to a small cemetery where nuns who had served at the hospital were buried. The cemetery was visible from room 12, a room that had earned a reputation among staff as being cursed. Room 12 was tucked away at the far end of the unit, isolated from the other patient rooms. It had once been a regular patient room but had been converted into a storage space after a series of unsettling incidents. The room had an oppressive atmosphere. Even during the day, it felt colder and darker than the rest of the unit. Most of us avoided going in there unless absolutely necessary. The legend of Rocking Mary was well known among the staff. Mary was a young nun who had worked at St. Joseph's in the 1950s. She was beloved by patients and staff alike for her kindness and dedication. Tragically, Mary died in a car accident just outside the hospital when she was only 30 years old. According to the stories, Mary's spirit never left St. Joseph's. Patients who stayed in room 12 often reported seeing a young woman in a white habit sitting by their bedside, rocking back and forth on an old wooden chair. She never spoke or made eye contact. She simply stared out the window toward the cemetery where she was buried. At first, these sightings were dismissed as hallucinations or symptoms of delirium. But over time, the reports became too consistent to ignore. Every patient described her in exactly the same way. Young, serene, and always rocking silently by their bedside. It was a quiet night shift, one of those rare evenings when everything seemed to be running smoothly. I was working with my colleague, Sarah Mitchell, and we were catching up on paperwork at the nurses' station when we heard it. A faint creaking sound coming from down the hall. Sarah looked up from her charting. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I nodded, my stomach tightening with unease. The sound was rhythmic, like someone rocking back and forth on a wooden chair. "It's coming from room 12, Sarah whispered. We exchanged nervous glances. Room 12 had been converted into a storage space years ago. There shouldn't have been anyone in there. "I'll check it out," I said reluctantly, grabbing a flashlight. As I approached room 12, the creaking grew louder. My heart pounded as I pushed open the door and shone my flashlight inside. The room was cluttered with old medical equipment and boxes of supplies, but there was no one there. The rocking stopped abruptly. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. Then I turned and hurried back to the nurse's station. "There's no one in there," I told Sarah. She frowned but didn't say anything. We both knew better than to dismiss what we'd heard. Later that night, one of our patients, a man named James Parker, called out for help from room 11, which was right next to room 12. James was recovering from pneumonia and had been stable all evening, so his sudden distress caught us off guard. When Sarah and I entered his room, he looked terrified. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. "There's someone in here," he said, his voice trembling. "A woman. She was sitting right there." He pointed to the corner of the room near his bed. Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances. "What did she look like?" Sarah asked. "She was young," James replied. "Wearing white, like one of those nuns." My blood ran cold. "Did she say anything?" I asked. James shook his head. "She just sat there rocking back and forth, staring out the window." By now, Sarah and I were thoroughly spooked. We tried to focus on our work for the rest of the night, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around 3 a.m., while making rounds alone, I passed by room 12 again. This time, I heard something even more chilling. Soft humming coming from inside the room. I froze in place, every instinct telling me to turn around and walk away, but something compelled me to look inside. When I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. There she was, a young woman in a white habit sitting on an old wooden rocking chair that hadn't been there before. She was exactly as patients had described, serene and silent, her gaze fixed on the cemetery outside the window. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved or spoke. Then she turned her head slowly toward me, and our eyes met. Her expression wasn't menacing or angry. It was sorrowful, as if she were carrying some unbearable burden. But her presence filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I stumbled backward out of the room and slammed the door shut behind me. When I turned around to run back to the nurse's station, Sarah was already standing there with wide eyes. "You saw her," she said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. The next morning, we reported what had happened to our supervisor. She listened patiently, but didn't seem surprised by our story. "Rocking Mary has been part of this hospital for decades," she said matter-of-factly. "She doesn't mean any harm, she's just here." Despite her reassurances, I couldn't bring myself to work another shift near room 12 after that night. A few months later, I transferred to another unit, and eventually left St. Joseph's altogether. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or why it happened, but it changed me forever. Hospitals are places where life begins and ends every day, a crossroads where energy lingers long after people are gone. And sometimes, that energy takes on a form we can see but never truly understand. Story 4. Don't let them take me. My name is Laura Evans, and I've been a nurse for nearly 15 years. I've worked in various departments, ER, ICU, pediatrics, but oncology has always been the hardest. It's not just the physical toll of caring for patients who are often at the end of their journeys. It's the emotional weight of witnessing so much suffering. But nothing prepared me for what happened one quiet night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night or the chilling words of a dying patient. St. Mary's was a mid-sized hospital in a small town, known for its compassionate care and dedicated staff. The oncology ward was located on the 4th floor, a quiet and somber space where time seemed to move differently. The air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and flowers left by hopeful families. I was floated to oncology that night, a last-minute change to cover for a sick colleague. I didn't mind. I had worked there before and knew most of the staff. But something about that night felt different from the moment I stepped onto the floor. The usual hum of activity was subdued, and an eerie stillness hung in the air. My assignment included a patient named Mrs. Margaret Harper, an elderly woman in her late 70s who had been battling advanced stage cancer. She had been unconscious for several days, her frail body barely clinging to life. Her family had said their goodbyes earlier that day, and now it was just me and her in room 14. I checked on her periodically throughout the night, adjusting her drip and monitoring her vitals. Each time I entered her room, I felt a strange unease, as though I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed deeper in there, and the air felt colder than in the rest of the ward. Around 2 a.m., I decided to sit with her for a while. Even though she was unconscious, I believed in offering comfort to my patients in their final hours. I held her hand and whispered words of reassurance, telling her it was okay to let go if she was ready. Just as I was about to leave her bedside, Mrs. Harper's eyes snapped open. I froze, startled by the sudden movement. Her gaze locked onto mine with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. "Don't let them take me," she whispered hoarsely. Her voice was weak but filled with fear, a kind of primal terror that I had never heard before. "Who?" I asked gently, trying to calm her. "Who's going to take you?" She lifted a trembling hand and pointed upward toward the ceiling. "That black thing," she said, her voice breaking. "It's waiting for me." I followed her gaze but saw nothing except the fluorescent lights casting their sterile glow on the white ceiling tiles. "It's okay," I said softly, squeezing her hand. "You're safe here." But she shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No, it's here. Don't let it take me." Before I could respond, Mrs. Harper's body convulsed violently as if she were fighting against some unseen force. Her eyes darted around the room wildly, and she clutched my arm with surprising strength. Then I saw it. A shadowy figure loomed in the corner of the room near the ceiling. A dark mass that seemed to pulse and shift like smoke caught in an invisible breeze. It had no discernible features but radiated an overwhelming sense of malevolence. I blinked hard, convinced my tired mind was playing tricks on me, but it didn't disappear. Mrs. Harper let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the ward. "Don't let it take me," she cried one last time before collapsing back onto the bed. The heart monitor flatlined. I stood there in stunned silence, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadowy figure lingered for a moment longer before dissipating into thin air, as if it had never been there at all. The room fell eerily silent except for the steady hum of machines around us. I called for help, and within minutes, my colleagues rushed into the room. We performed all necessary protocols to confirm Mrs. Harper's passing and documented everything as required. But I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone about what I had seen, or what Mrs. Harper had said in those final moments. Who would believe me? Later that night, as I sat at the nurse's station trying to process what had happened, I heard faint whispering coming from down the hall near room 14. It was barely audible at first but grew louder as if multiple voices were overlapping each other in an unintelligible chorus. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way toward the source of the sound. When I reached room 14, the whispering stopped abruptly. The room was empty except for Mrs. Harper's lifeless body lying peacefully on the bed. But then something caught my eye. A faint black smudge on one of the ceiling tiles where I had seen the shadowy figure earlier. The next morning, as we prepared Mrs. Harper's body for transport to the morgue, one of my colleagues, an older nurse named Evelyn, noticed how shaken I looked. "Are you okay?" she asked kindly. I hesitated before finally confiding in her about what had happened during the night. To my surprise, Evelyn didn't dismiss my story or laugh it off as exhaustion-induced hallucinations. "You're not crazy," she said quietly after listening intently. "I've seen it too." She went on to explain that several staff members over the years had reported seeing a similar dark figure near dying patients, always described as a shadowy mass with no discernible features but an undeniable presence of evil. "Some people think it's death," Evelyn said solemnly. "Others think it's something worse." I left St. Mary's Hospital shortly after that night shift, not because of fear but because I couldn't bear to work in oncology anymore after what I had witnessed. To this day, I don't know what that black shape was or why Mrs. Harper was so terrified of it, but her words still haunt me. "Jenny, don't let them take me. Jenny." Hospitals are places where life begins and ends every day, a crossroads where energies linger long after people are gone. And sometimes, those energies take forms we can see but never truly understand. That's the end of these scary hospitals' true stories. If you enjoyed listening to these stories, then do like and subscribe to Horror Vault to keep listening to our upcoming true horror stories. I will see you in the next video.